So here I am, rookie, excuse me. Terry Cummings is on his way out, but at the time he's playing with Milwaukee. Terry Cummings was strong as shit, and that's when I knew the difference between grown man strength and weight room strength.
By the time I was 16, I was playing against Dr. J, and I was playing against a lot of the professional guys. They were coming to our league. It was much like the Rutgers in New York, but it was huge in Chicago. So by the time I was 16, I already knew I could play pro ball. I just didn't know I was going to get that opportunity.
Terry Cummings said one opponent made him want to retire, and at 64 years old, he's finally naming the 5 players who pushed him to his absolute breaking point. These weren't just tough matchups. These were battles that tested everything he had, physically and mentally, night after night for 19 years. Each one brought a different kind of pain, a different challenge that forced Cummings to dig deeper than he thought possible. And the craziest part? One of these legends is the only player in NBA history to accomplish something against Michael Jordan that no one else ever did. Terry Cummings wasn't some role player sharing war stories. He was the real deal. In 1982, the San Diego Clippers took him 2nd overall in the draft, and he immediately proved he belonged. He won Rookie of the Year, averaging 23.7 points and 10.4 rebounds per game. 2 years later, he got traded to the Milwaukee Bucks, where he became a 2-time All-Star and helped build a championship contender alongside defensive legends like Sidney Moncrief and Pressey. What made Cummings unique was his position. At 6'9", he was what people called a tweener. But in the 1980s, being a tweener meant guarding everyone. Cummings had the size to bang with power forwards and the quickness to blow past small forwards. One night, it was Moses Malone pounding him in the post. The next night, it was Larry Bird outsmarting him on the wing. Cummings was the skeleton key of the Bucks' defense, the guy who had to check every type of offensive threat the league threw at him. When Cummings talks about toughness, he's not talking about guys who just hit hard or talked trash. Toughness was mental resilience, physical durability, and the will to dominate. His list doesn't include enforcers or role players. He names 5 Hall of Famers, 5 players who dominated elite competition every single time they stepped on the court. Let's start with Michael Jordan, because this is where things get wild. Terry Cummings is the only player in NBA history to outscore Michael Jordan in a playoff series. Not just outscore him in a game, in an entire series. The 1985 Eastern Conference first round was the Milwaukee Bucks versus the Chicago Bulls. Milwaukee was the higher seed, a defensive powerhouse coached by Don Nelson. Chicago was basically a one-man show, with a rookie Jordan dragging a mediocre roster into the postseason. Over 4 games, Jordan scored 117 total points. Cummings scored 118, just 1 more point. But in the history books, that 1 point means everything. Jordan shot 43.6% from the field, struggling against the elite perimeter defense of Moncrief and Pressey. Cummings dominated the interior, shooting an insane 63.3%. He averaged 29.5 points per game, playing at the absolute peak of his abilities. Now here's why Cummings views Jordan as tough. It's not because Jordan beat him. Cummings won that series. It's because Jordan, despite being swarmed by the best defensive backcourt in the league and facing an all-star forward, refused to quit. Jordan forced Cummings to play the best basketball of his life just to survive. That's exhausting. Cummings remembers a young Jordan who didn't have the polished fadeaway of the 90s. Instead, he had relentless attacks on the rim. Cummings often describes it simply: he dunked on the whole team. For a forward like Cummings, whose job included secondary rim protection, Jordan presented an impossible choice. Step up to challenge the shot and risk being on a poster or fouling out. Stay back and watch Jordan's mid-range pull-up destroy the defense. Cummings watched Jordan evolve from that raw athletic phenomenon of 1985 into the cerebral assassin of the 1990s. By the time the Bulls and Bucks met again in the playoffs in 1990, Jordan had added weight room strength to his natural agility. Defeating Jordan in 1985 required a level of effort that was completely unsustainable. It was the hardest 3-1 series victory of Cummings' entire life, proving that Jordan's presence alone drained the opposing team's mental and physical reserves to their breaking point. If Michael Jordan was the physical storm, Larry Bird was the psychological fog. Cummings calls Bird a master psychologist, and that label offers a window into the mental toll of professional basketball in the 1980s. The Bucks and Celtics were constant rivals, meeting frequently in high-stakes games. Cummings admits openly that Bird was not a great athlete in the traditional sense. He didn't have the vertical leap of Dr. J or the sprint speed of Jordan, but Bird knew the game better than anyone Cummings ever faced. For Cummings, an explosive athlete, guarding Bird was pure frustration. He could physically overpower Bird, bump him off his spots, and contest his shots. Yet Bird would still dominate the game. How? Superior processing speed. Bird knew where the ball was going before it even left the passer's hand. Now he understood angles and leverage, using his body to shield defenders from the ball in ways that completely negated Cummings' athletic advantage. The master psychologist label also comes from Bird's legendary trash talk and his ability to demoralize opponents. Cummings remembers the aura Bird projected on the court. He was the boss and everyone knew it. Bird would tell Cummings exactly how he was going to score and then do it. That wasn't just a defensive failure, that was a failure of will. Bird's willingness to play through injury with a bad back or with illness and still drop 30 points was psychological torture. It signaled that no matter how hard they played, Bird's will was stronger. Cummings and Bird were both elite mid-range scorers, so their matchups often turned into shootouts. Cummings had a high-release jumper that was difficult to block, but Bird's shot was virtually contest-proof because of his high release point and quick trigger. Bird forced Cummings to become a smarter player. You couldn't beat Bird with athleticism alone. You had to outthink him, which was nearly impossible. This intellectual toughness is why Bird earned his spot on the list. Julius Erving occupies a unique space in Cummings' mind. He was the idol who became the adversary. Growing up in Chicago, Cummings revered Dr. J as the coolest player in basketball, but the reality of guarding Erving shattered any notion that he was just a finesse player. Cummings' analysis focuses on deceptive strength. On television, Erving looked slender, gliding through the air with effortless grace. On the court, in the close quarters of the post, he was wiry and incredibly strong. Cummings operated well in horizontal space, using his wide shoulders to create separation on the ground. Erving dominated vertical space. His ability to hang in the air and adjust his shot meant that Cummings often contested a shot that was no longer there. By the time Cummings landed, Erving was still elevating or releasing the ball at a different angle. The toughness Cummings cites is Erving's ability to absorb the hard fouls of the 80s. Cummings would body Erving on drives, expecting to knock him off balance. Instead, Erving would absorb the contact in his core and finish the play anyway. Cummings entered the league just as Erving was transitioning from his athletic prime to his elder statesman phase. Yet Erving remained formidable. The 1983 playoffs, where the Sixers swept through the league, served as Cummings' welcome to the NBA moment. Erving taught Cummings that toughness wasn't about grimacing or throwing hard fouls. It was about maintaining composure and execution while being physically battered. Before we continue, if you're loving this deep dive into the toughest players of the golden era, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Who do you think was the toughest opponent in NBA history? Was it one of these 5, or does someone else deserve that title? Now let's talk about Moses Malone, because if Bird was the mind and Jordan was the skill, Moses Malone was pure labor. Cummings' description of facing Moses is visceral. It's like wrestling a bear for 48 minutes. Playing against Moses wasn't just difficult, it was painful. Moses Malone is the greatest offensive rebounder in NBA history, and his strategy was brutal. He would miss shots intentionally or tip the ball to himself just to keep the play alive. For Cummings, whose job was to box out, this was a nightmare. A normal 24-second possession could turn into a 45-second wrestling match. Most players retreat on defense after a missed shot. Moses surged forward. That meant Cummings could never relax. The mental fatigue of knowing that every missed shot would result in a physical collision defined Moses' toughness. Moses Malone wasn't concerned with aesthetics. He wore knee pads and played a game that took place entirely below the rim. For Cummings, facing Moses was a war of attrition. Moses would lean on defenders, elbow them, and wear them down so that by the fourth quarter, their legs were completely gone. Cummings, who relied heavily on his jump shot, found his own offense suffering after battling Moses on the defensive end. The toughness here is pure endurance, the ability to turn a basketball game into a street fight. Cummings' inclusion of Moses is also a historical correction. Moses is often forgotten in the Bird versus Magic narrative, but in the early 80s, Moses was the MVP and the most dominant force in the league. His toughness was the gold standard that players like Cummings tried to emulate. The final member of Cummings' list is Karl Malone, and he represents the evolutionary endpoint of the position Cummings himself played. Known as the mailman, Karl Malone brought a level of strength and conditioning that changed the game. Cummings distinguishes Malone's physicality as country strong or grown man strength. Gym strength is aesthetic. Country strength is immovable leverage. When Cummings faced Malone in Western Conference matchups, he notes that Malone Malone ran the floor like a guard despite his size. The toughness was in the relentlessness of Malone's transition game. He would sprint the floor, seal his defender deep in the paint, and demand the ball every single possession. Karl Malone's conditioning was a key differentiator. He rarely missed games and played heavy minutes year after year. For Cummings, this meant there was no respite. Guarding the Stockton to Malone pick and roll was the most physically demanding defensive assignment in the league. Malone set screens that felt like running into a brick wall. Cummings had to absorb that impact dozens of times per game. Knowing that Malone was stronger, faster, and in better shape meant Cummings had to play a perfect technical game to compete. Malone represents the juggernaut, a player who combined Moses Malone's work ethic with the athletic gifts of a new generation. Here's where it gets really interesting. While Cummings lists these giants, there's a recursive loop of respect in the NBA. Rasheed Wallace, one of the most intimidating players of the late 90s, names Terry Cummings as his toughest opponent. Wallace recounts his rookie season in 1995 when he faced an aging Cummings. Wallace expected to dominate the old man, only to get completely schooled. Wallace describes Cummings as cutting through his defense like a hot knife through butter. He notes that Cummings possessed grown man with kid's strength, contrasting it with his own weight room strength. Despite being past his prime, Cummings used his immense strength and footwork to dislodge the young Wallace effortlessly. This validates Cummings' list in a powerful way. It proves that the toughness Cummings learned from Moses Malone and Dr. J was transmitted to the next generation. There's a clear lineage. Moses Malone taught Terry Cummings the bear wrestle. Terry Cummings taught Rasheed Wallace grown man strength. If an old Cummings was the toughest cover for Rasheed Wallace, imagine how terrifying a prime Moses Malone or Larry Bird must have been. What makes Cummings' list fascinating is that it's a taxonomy of dominance that defined the golden era. Michael Jordan represents the phenomenon, the kinetic overload requiring entire team focus. Larry Bird represents the mastermind, the psychological warfare forcing opponents to outthink rather than outplay. Julius Erving represents the icon, the deceptive strength operating on a different plane. Moses Malone represents the workhorse, the physical attrition leaving opponents battered. And Karl Malone represents the juggernaut, perfect combination of conditioning, power, and durability. A deeper insight emerges from Cummings' experience. In the modern NBA, a 6'9" player with his skill set would be a small ball center or a pure wing. In his era, he was a tweener. But being a tweener in the 80s was the ultimate challenge. He was the universal soldier of the defense. He had to be strong enough for the Malones and fast enough for Bird and Erving. A pure center wouldn't list Michael Jordan. A pure guard wouldn't list Moses Malone. Only a player like Cummings, who lived between positions, would face the full spectrum of the league's elite. The All the Smoke podcast, hosted by Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson, functions as a modern oral history archive for the NBA. Cummings' appearance and the viral nature of his quotes represent a reclamation of narrative. For decades, the story of the 80s has been told through the lens of Boston and Los Angeles. Cummings, representing the Milwaukee Bucks and the near greats, is reminding the world that the gap between the legends and the rest was often narrower and more physically violent than the history books suggest. What stands out most is the respect woven through every part of Cummings' reflections. He's not bitter, he's honoring them. These were the players who made me better. These were the nights I had to bring everything just to stay on the court. Jordan forced him to reach his ceiling. Bird forced him to think. Erving showed him grace under fire. Moses taught him endurance. And Karl Malone showed him what the future looked like. Terry Cummings' selection of these 5 players is a definitive document of NBA history. It respects all facets of the game: the mind, the body, the spirit, the art, and the ultimate combination of all 4. Through his 1985 playoff performance against Jordan, through his battles with Bird's psychological warfare, through the physical toll of Moses Malone, through the deceptive strength of Dr. J, and through the relentless evolution represented by Karl Malone, Cummings establishes himself not just as a witness to greatness, but as a participant in it. His testimony stands as a monument to an era where toughness was not a statistic, but a survival requirement. As the NBA continues to evolve into a game of space and pace, Cummings' recollections serve as a necessary anchor. They remind us of the blood, sweat, and dirt that paved the way. The players he faced didn't just win games, they imposed their will. They broke opponents mentally and physically, and in doing so, they created a standard of excellence that still echoes through the league. At 64 years old, Terry Cummings isn't chasing glory. He's offering perspective. This is what it took. This is what we survived. And these 5 players were the absolute toughest of an impossibly tough era. Each one brought something different, something that couldn't be replicated. Together, they represent the complete picture of what dominance looked like in the golden age of basketball. So before you go, make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment. Out of these 5 legends, who do you think would be the toughest to guard? Would it be Jordan's relentless attack, Bird's mind games, Dr. J's vertical dominance, Moses's war of attrition, or Karl Malone's perfect conditioning? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.